Hello, guys. I'm going to be reading chapter 14 of Walk Two Moons. 14, The Rhododendron. One Saturday, I was at Phoebe's again. Her father was golfing and her mother was running errands. Mrs. Winterbottom had read out a long list to us of where she would be in case we needed her. She almost did not go because she did not want to leave Phoebe and me alone, but Phoebe promised to keep all the doors locked and not open the door for anyone. If we heard any noises at all, we were supposed to call the police immediately. After you call the police, Mrs. Winterbottom said, call Mrs. Cadaver. I think she's home today. I'm sure she would come right over. Oh, sure, Phoebe whispered to me. That's about the last person I would call. Phoebe imagined that every noise was the lunatic sneaking in or out, or the message leaver creeping up to the drop off another anonymous note. She was so jumpy that I began to feel uneasy too. After her mother left, Phoebe said, Mrs. Cadaver works odd hours, doesn't she? Sometimes she works every night for a week, straggling home when most people are waking up, but sometimes she works during the day. She's a nurse, so I guess she works different shifts, I said. That day, Mrs. Cadaver was home, puttering around her garden. We saw her from Phoebe's bedroom window. Actually, puttering is not the best word. What she was doing was more like slogging and slashing. Mrs. Cadaver hacked branches off of trees and hauled these to the back of her lot, where she lumped them into a pile of branches, which she had hacked off last week. I told you she was as strong as an ox, Phoebe said. Next, Mrs. Cadaver slashed and sliced at a pitiful rose bush which had been trying to creep up the side of her house. Then she sheared off the tops of the hedge which borders Phoebe's yard. She moved on to a rhododendron bush, which she was poking and prodding when a car pulled into her driveway. A tall man with bushy black hair leaped out and seeing her, he practically skipped to where she was. They hugged each other. Oh no, Phoebe said. The man with the bushy black hair was Mr. Berkway, our English teacher. Mrs. Cadaver pointed to the rhododendron bush and then at the axe, but Mr. Berkway shook his head. He disappeared into the garage and returned with two shovels. Then he and Mrs. Cadaver er, gouged and prodded and tunneled around in the dirt until the poor old rhododendron hopped onto its side. Mrs. Cadaver and Mr. Berkway lugged the bush over to the opposite side of the yard where there was a mound of dirt. Phoebe's doorbell rang. Come with me, Phoebe said. But I want to watch Mrs. Cadaver and Mr. Berkway. I'm not answering the door alone, Phoebe said. I went with her. We looked out the window. No one's there, I said. We're not supposed to open the door. But no one's there, I said. I flung open the door. No one was on the porch. I put one foot on the porch and looked up and down the street. Quick, Phoebe said. Get back in here. Maybe someone is in the bushes. I pulled my foot back inside. We closed the door and locked it. By the time we returned to Phoebe's bedroom window, Mrs. Cadaver and Mr. Berkway had replanted the bush. Maybe there's something hidden under the bush, Phoebe said. Like what? Like a dead body. Maybe Mr. Berkway helped her chop up her husband and bury him, and maybe they were getting worried and decided to disguise the spot with a rhododendron bush. I must have looked skeptical. Phoebe said, Sal, you never can tell. And, Sal, I don't think you or your father should go over there anymore. I certainly agreed with her on that one. Dad and I had been there 2 nights earlier, and I had hardly been able to sit still. I started noticing all those frightening things in Margaret's house, creepy masks and old swords, books with titles like Murder on the Rue Morgue and The Skull and the Hatchet. Margaret cornered me in the kitchen and said, "So, t- what has your father told you about me?" Nothing, I said. Oh, she seemed disappointed. My father's behavior was always different at Margaret's home. At home, I would sometimes find him sitting on his bed staring at the floor or reading through old letters or gazing at a photo album. He looked sad and lonely, but at Margaret's, he would smile and sometimes even laugh. And once she touched his hand, and he let her hand rest there on top of his. I didn't like it. I didn't want my father to be sad, but at least when he was sad, I knew he was remembering my mother. So when Phoebe suggested that my